The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana wilderness, driving snow so thick that Jake Thornton could barely see his own outstretched hand. His weathered face, carved by 43 winters on the frontier, squinted through the blizzard as he guided his horse toward the dim outline of his cabin. The storm had come from nowhere, transforming what should have been a simple ride back from town into a battle for survival. Jake had been alone for 3 years now, ever since the fever took his wife Martha and their unborn child. The isolation suited him fine most days, but nights like this made the silence inside his bones feel heavier than the snow accumulating on his shoulders. His cabin sat in a valley between two ridges, sheltered enough to survive the worst storms but remote enough that he might not see another soul for months. As he approached his property, something made him stop. A sound, barely audible above the wind's fury. He tilted his head, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft whimpering, almost like an injured animal. But there was something different about it, something that made his heart quicken with recognition. Dismounting quickly, Jake tied his horse to the post and grabbed his lantern from the saddlebag. The flame flickered wildly in the wind as he followed the sound, his boots crunching through knee-deep snow. 20 yards from his cabin, near a cluster of pine trees, he found the source. A small figure huddled against the base of the largest tree, covered in snow that had already begun to freeze on tiny shoulders. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he knelt down and brushed away the white powder, revealing the face of a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old. The little one's lips were blue, eyes closed, but still breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. Without hesitation, Jake scooped the child into his arms, surprised by how light the small body felt, like holding a bundle of twigs. The child stirred slightly at the movement, dark eyes fluttering open for just a moment before closing again. In that brief glimpse, Jake saw something that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion, a look of such vulnerability and trust that it reminded him of the children he and Martha had dreamed of having. Racing against time in the worsening storm, Jake carried the child into his cabin and immediately set about building up the fire. The interior of his home was sparse but warm, furnished with hand-built furniture and the few precious belongings he and Martha had accumulated. He laid the child on his own bed, wrapping the small form in every blanket he owned. As he worked to warm the cabin, Jake studied the child more closely. The clothing was unfamiliar, made of soft leather, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns he didn't recognize. The child's skin was darker than his own, with high cheekbones and straight black hair that fell in a single braid down one shoulder. This was a native child, probably from one of the tribes that moved through the valley during certain seasons. Jake had lived on the frontier long enough to know that relations between settlers and native peoples were complicated at best, often violent at worst. But looking at this small, helpless person fighting for life in his bed, politics and prejudice seemed as distant as the storm seemed eternal. This was simply a child who needed help, and Jake Thornton had never been able to turn his back on someone in need. He heated water and began the careful process of warming the child's hands and feet, watching for signs of frostbite. As circulation returned, the child began to stir more frequently, making soft sounds in a language Jake didn't understand. But the tone was clear enough. Confusion, fear, and pain, all mixed together in the voice of someone far too young to be alone in such a wilderness. By midnight, the child was conscious and sitting up, accepting small sips of the warm broth Jake had prepared. Neither of them spoke the other's language, but they communicated through gestures and expressions that transcended words. The child pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Aiyana, which Jake took to be a name. Aiyana, Jake repeated, and the child nodded with a small smile that transformed his entire face. Jake pointed to himself and said, Jake, which the child attempted to pronounce with adorable difficulty, coming out more like Jake. As the night wore on, Jake found himself telling Aiyana about his life, even though the boy couldn't understand the words. He spoke about Martha, about the dreams they'd shared, about the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Somehow, having someone to talk to, even someone who couldn't respond in kind, felt like medicine for wounds he hadn't realized were still bleeding. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, an unlikely friendship was beginning to bloom. Aiyana showed Jake some of the beadwork on his clothing, tracing the patterns with small fingers and speaking in his native tongue with obvious pride. Jake found himself captivated by the artistry, the way each bead seemed to tell part of a larger story. When exhaustion finally claimed them both, Jake made a bed for himself on the floor near the fire, insisting that Aiyana keep the warm bed. As he lay there listening to the child's peaceful breathing, Jake realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years: purpose. For the first time since Martha's death, he had someone who needed him, someone whose welfare mattered more than his own comfort or convenience. Outside, the wind began to die down, and the snow fell more gently, as if the storm itself was settling into sleep. Neither Jake nor Aiyana knew that this night would change both their lives forever, setting in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about friendship, family, and the meaning of home. Jake woke before dawn to find Aiyana sitting by the window, staring out at the transformed landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world draped in pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the early morning light. The child's expression was one of deep longing, and Jake realized that despite the warmth and safety of the cabin, Aiyana was thinking of home. After a simple breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, which Aiyana approached with curious interest, Jake began trying to understand where the boy had come from. Using gestures and crude drawings in the dirt by the fireplace, he tried to ask about Aiyana's family and tribe. The child's responses were animated but largely incomprehensible, though Jake gathered that Aiyana had been traveling with others when the storm struck. As the morning progressed, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of waiting for someone to come looking for Aiyana, he would take the boy out to search for signs of his people. It was dangerous, potentially foolish, but something deep in his heart told him it was the right thing to do. They bundled up in warm clothes, Jake finding some of Martha's smaller garments that had been stored away, and set out into the winter wonderland. Aiyana proved to be remarkably resilient and knowledgeable about the outdoors, pointing out tracks in the snow and signs that Jake would have missed. The boy had clearly been raised in harmony with the natural world in ways that impressed the experienced frontiersman. About 2 miles from the cabin, they found evidence of what had happened. A small camp showed signs of hasty abandonment, with scattered belongings partially buried in snow. Aiyana became agitated, calling out in his native language and running from spot to spot, clearly looking for specific people. Jake's heart sank as he realized the implications. Aiyana's family or traveling companions had been caught in the storm and had likely continued moving, possibly not even realizing the child was missing until it was too late to return safely. In the chaos of the blizzard, a small boy could easily become separated from the group and lost in the whiteout conditions. That evening, as they returned to the cabin, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from his chimney, but he was certain he had banked the fire before leaving. Someone was in his home. Motioning for Aiyana to stay hidden behind a tree, Jake approached the cabin cautiously, his rifle ready. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes of at least 3 people moving around inside. His mind raced through possibilities. Outlaws seeking shelter, other settlers, or perhaps members of Aiyana's tribe who had come looking for the boy. As he got closer, he heard voices speaking in the same language Aiyana used. His pulse quickened as he realized these might be the child's people, but frontier life had taught him to be cautious. Not all encounters between settlers and Native Americans ended peacefully, regardless of good intentions on either side. Jake made his decision. He called out to Aiyana, who came running from his hiding place with obvious joy and relief. The boy rushed toward the cabin, shouting something that brought immediate response from inside. The door burst open, and 3 native men emerged, followed by a woman whose face was streaked with tears. What happened next would remain etched in Jake's memory forever. The woman, clearly Aiyana's mother, dropped to her knees and pulled the boy into her arms, sobbing with relief and speaking rapidly in their native tongue. The men, who Jake assumed were the child's father and uncles, watched this reunion with expressions of profound gratitude mixed with wariness. For a long moment, the 2 groups studied each other across the cultural divide. Jake stood with his rifle lowered but ready, uncertain of what would happen next. The native men were armed as well, but their weapons remained at their sides. Everyone seemed to understand that they stood at a crossroads where the next few moments would determine whether this encounter would be remembered as a blessing or a tragedy. Then Aiyana broke free from his mother's embrace and ran to Jake, taking the cowboy's weathered hand and leading him toward his family. The boy spoke rapidly, gesturing between Jake and his relatives, clearly explaining what had happened. The transformation in the adult's expressions was immediate and remarkable. The man who appeared to be Aiyana's father stepped forward and extended his hand in the universal gesture of friendship. When Jake accepted it, the handshake lasted longer than usual, accompanied by words spoken in heavily accented but clear English. "You save my son. You are good man." What followed was an evening that challenged every assumption Jake had held about the cultural divide between settlers and native peoples. Aiyana's family, Jake learned, was part of a larger group that had been traveling to winter camps when the storm struck. In the confusion and blinding snow, they had lost track of Aiyana and had been forced to take shelter themselves, unable to search until the weather cleared. The boy's mother, whose name sounded like Chinoa, prepared a meal using ingredients she had brought, combined with supplies from Jake's pantry. The result was unlike anything Jake had ever tasted, a rich stew flavored with herbs and seasonings that created warmth in his belly and his heart simultaneously. Through a mixture of English words, gestures, and Aiyana's enthusiastic translations, Jake learned that the family belonged to a peaceful band that had been traveling these mountains for generations. They were not the savage warriors that sensational newspaper stories often portrayed, but rather a close-knit community of families trying to maintain their traditional way of life while adapting to a rapidly changing world. Aiyana's father, who introduced himself as Dakota, was clearly a man of importance within his community. His bearing suggested leadership, but he wore his authority lightly, more like a shepherd than a king. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself genuinely enjoying the company of these people who had started as strangers and were rapidly becoming something approaching friends. The most remarkable moment came when Chenoa approached Jake with tears in her eyes and spoke to him in her native language. Dakota translated, "She says you are now family. You risked much to save our son, and this creates a bond that can never be broken." Jake felt his own eyes begin to water as he looked around the cabin that had been filled with loneliness for so long, now warm with the laughter and conversation of people who had welcomed him into their hearts without reservation. As dawn approached, Jake knew that his new friends would need to leave to rejoin their larger group. The parting was more difficult than he had expected, especially saying goodbye to Aiyana, who had become like the son he and Martha had never been able to have. But Dakota had one more surprise. Speaking carefully in his limited English, he explained that Jake's act of kindness had been observed by more than just the immediate family. Word of what the lone cowboy had done would spread throughout the tribe, and they would remember. "You have given us the most precious gift," Dakota said, placing his hand on Jake's shoulder. "You have given us hope that good people exist on both sides of the great divide between our peoples." As the family prepared to leave, Chenoa approached Jake with something wrapped in soft leather. When he unwrapped it, he found a medicine bag, intricately beaded with the same patterns he had admired on Aiyana's clothing. Through Dakota, she explained that it had been made by her grandmother and was filled with herbs and stones that would bring protection and good fortune. Aiyana, meanwhile, had his own gift. The boy removed a small carved wooden horse from around his neck, clearly a treasured possession, and pressed it into Jake's palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing a running Mustang with its mane flowing in an invisible wind. Jake tried to protest that he couldn't accept such valuable gifts, but Dakota shook his head firmly. "In our culture, when someone saves a life, they become responsible for that life forever. But also, that person whose life was saved becomes responsible for the soul of their savior. These gifts are not payment. They are symbols of a connection that will last as long as the mountains stand." The goodbyes were tearful but hopeful. As Jake watched the family disappear into the forest, he felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. Something told him that this was not truly goodbye, but rather the beginning of something larger than he could yet imagine. 3 weeks passed quietly, with Jake falling back into his routine of caring for his livestock, maintaining his property, and enduring the long winter evenings alone. But something fundamental had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb for his past happiness. Instead, it felt like a place where miracles could happen. Jake found himself wearing the medicine bag every day, and he kept Aiyana's carved horse on the mantelpiece where he could see it constantly. More than mere keepsakes, these items had become tangible reminders that he was connected to something larger than his own solitary existence. The first sign that his life was about to change again came on a crystal-clear morning when he spotted smoke rising from multiple locations in the valley below his cabin. At first, Jake worried that perhaps there was a wildfire, but as he studied the scene through his spyglass, he realized the smoke was coming from campfires, many of them. By afternoon, Jake could make out figures moving through the trees, and his heart began to race with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. These were not soldiers or settlers. The movement patterns and the way they traveled through the forest marked them clearly as Native Americans. As evening approached, Jake found himself facing a dilemma. Should he remain in his cabin and wait to see what developed, or should he venture out to make contact? The decision was made for him when he heard the sound of many voices singing in the distance, a haunting melody that seemed to rise and fall with the mountain wind itself. Unable to resist, Jake stepped outside and followed the sound to a ridge that overlooked the main valley. What he saw there took his breath away and challenged every assumption he had ever held about the indigenous peoples of the region. Below him, spread across the valley floor, was an entire community. Not a war party or a raiding band, but families with children, elders, and all the complex social structure of a complete society. Dozens of lodges had been erected in careful patterns, and fires burned throughout the camp, creating a constellation of warm light against the snow. But what struck Jake most powerfully was the atmosphere of celebration that seemed to permeate the entire gathering. This was not a community in distress or preparing for conflict. This was a people engaged in some kind of joyous ceremony. As Jake stood transfixed by the scene below, he heard footsteps approaching through the snow behind him. He turned to find Dakota walking toward him, accompanied by several other men Jake didn't recognize. But instead of the cautious wariness that had marked their first meeting, Dakota's face was lit up with a broad smile. "My friend Dakota," called out in his careful English, "we have been waiting for you to come see us. It is time." "Time for what?" Jake asked, though something deep in his chest was already beginning to understand. "Time for you to understand what your kindness has brought to our people," said another man, stepping forward. This speaker's English was more fluent, and he carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am Chief White Eagle, and I have traveled many days to meet the man who saved the grandson of my sister." Jake's mind reeled as he realized the implications. Aiyana was not just any child. He was the grandson of a chief, making him essentially Native American royalty. And Jake, a simple cowboy grieving his losses in a remote cabin, had unknowingly rescued one of the most precious members of an entire tribal community. "The boy is your sister's grandson?" Jake asked, still trying to process this information. "Chenoa is my youngest sister," White Eagle confirmed. "And when word spread through our winter camps about what you had done, it created something that has not happened in many years. It created unity." White Eagle explained that news of Jake's kindness had traveled from band to band, carried by messengers who rode through snow and cold to share the story. Gradually, a consensus had emerged among the scattered groups. This act of mercy deserved recognition not just from Aiyana's immediate family, but from the entire tribe. "You have shown us that not all white men see us as enemies to be destroyed or obstacles to be removed," White Eagle continued. "You have shown us that some of your people are capable of seeing our children as simply children, worthy of protection and care regardless of the color of their skin." As they talked, more people began to emerge from the forest around them. Men, women, children, and elders, all walking slowly toward the ridge where Jake stood. He realized with growing amazement that the entire community below was coming to meet him. What happened next would be talked about around campfires and in frontier towns for generations to come. As the sun rose over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink, Jake found himself at the center of a ceremony unlike anything he had ever imagined. The entire tribe, nearly 300 people, had arranged themselves in a great circle around Jake's cabin. At a signal from Chief White Eagle, they began to sing, the same haunting melody Jake had heard the night before, but now he could understand that it was a song of gratitude and blessing. Then came the gifts. Family after family approached Jake, each bearing something precious. Hand-woven blankets of extraordinary beauty, carved weapons and tools that represented months of skilled labor, jewelry made from silver and turquoise that sparkled like captured starlight, and foods prepared according to recipes passed down through generations. But the gifts were more than mere objects. They were symbols of acceptance and respect that transcended cultural boundaries. A respected warrior presented Jake with a magnificent bow, explaining through an interpreter that it had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. An elderly woman gave him a parfleche container filled with medicinal herbs, sharing through gestures and broken English that these plants could heal almost any ailment. Children approached shyly, offering simple but heartfelt gifts, painted stones, braided grass bracelets, and drawings made with charcoal on pieces of birch bark. Each gift was accompanied by smiles and attempts at English greetings that melted Jake's heart completely. The culmination came when Chief White Eagle presented Jake with an eagle feather, explaining that this was the highest honor their people could bestow on someone outside their community. This feather represents courage, wisdom, and the connection between earth and sky, the chief said solemnly. By accepting it, you become forever a friend to our people, welcome in any camp, protected by any warrior, and remembered in the stories we tell our children. As the ceremony concluded, Jake found himself surrounded by Aiyana's extended family. The boy himself had grown in the weeks since their parting, but his eyes still lit up with the same joy when he saw his rescuer. Chenoa embraced Jake like a son, and even the stoic men of the tribe clasped his hand with genuine warmth. But perhaps the most moving moment came when an ancient grandmother, supported by younger relatives, approached Jake with trembling hands and spoke to him in a voice barely above a whisper. The interpreter explained her words. She says that in her 93 winters, she has seen much conflict between our peoples. But today, she has seen proof that the Great Spirit still works miracles through human kindness. She says you have given her hope for her great-grandchildren's future. As the tribe began to disperse, returning to their various winter camps, Jake stood in front of his cabin surrounded by gifts that represented more wealth than he had ever possessed. But more than material riches, he had been given something infinitely more precious, a sense of purpose and connection that filled the emptiness in his heart. Dakota was among the last to leave, and he had one final surprise for his friend. "My son speaks of you every day," he told Jake. "He says you taught him that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to help others despite being afraid. He wants to be like you when he grows up." As Jake watched the last of his visitors disappear into the forest, he realized that his life had been fundamentally transformed. The lonely cowboy who had rescued a lost child in a snowstorm had received far more than he had given. He had been welcomed into a community, honored as a hero, and most importantly, he had rediscovered his faith in the basic goodness that could exist between people, regardless of their differences. That night, as he sat by his fire surrounded by the beautiful gifts from his new friends, Jake took out a pencil and paper and began to write a letter to his brother in Kansas. "Dear Thomas," he began, "you won't believe what has happened to me. I have learned that sometimes the greatest rewards in life come not from what we take, but from what we give freely, especially when we give without any expectation of return." Outside, the winter wind sang softly through the pines, but it no longer sounded lonely to Jake Thornton. It sounded like a lullaby, like a promise, like the voice of a world full of unexpected possibilities and connections waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to open their hearts to strangers in need. The carved wooden horse on his mantelpiece caught the firelight and seemed almost to come alive, running forever toward a horizon bright with hope. And for the first time in 3 years, Jake Thornton fell asleep with a smile on his face, knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures in a world that had revealed itself to be far more beautiful and connected than he had ever dared to imagine.